many ways it kind of picks up where we left off in that book. But the most remarkable connection to the year 2012 in the book Apollyon Rising 2012 was how the Maya had recognized that there was a direct link between the 2 years, 1776 and 2012, in a way that, if you will recall, Steve, you and I talked about this a couple of years ago, that Richard Luxton, who was the academic that had interpreted the Book of the Kumeyaal, the council book of the Yucatec Maya, from the 1500s, it was what he put in his personal notations on Katun 13 Ehu. He wrote this, and I grabbed it while we were on this break. He wrote this. He wrote, quote, "The dates that accompany the illustrations approximate real counts. Katun 13 Ehu began in the colonial count 1776, and the end of the Eastern Katun cycle in 13 Ehu is intermingled here with elements of the Christian Last Judgment. Whether this paradigm was also intended for the end of the long count in 2012 is open to question," end quote. And when I first found that years ago, I found that that statement is what then caused me to begin communicating to different Bible scholars and asking them, do you know of any direct connection between the Great Seal of the United States of America and the year 2012? And the reason I was asking that is when I saw this connection between 1776 and 2012 and the 13-stepped countdown, the Katun 13 Ehu, immediately what happened was the Great Seal of the United States jumped into my mind, where at the base of a 13-stepped pyramid you have the year 1776, over which is hovering the all-seeing eye of Apollo. Now, we're not going to talk about that. By the way, if people want to know more about that and that conversation, Steve Quayle and I did, I forget how many hours on that very subject. It is still over there on the website, ApollionRising.com or ApollionRising2012.com. And if you go over there, you'll find the website that Steve and I did. And what's ironic, Steve, is there's a quote down there from David Flynn talking about how he thought it was one of the best shows he had ever heard. So isn't that ironic? But people can go over there and they can listen all about that and find out all about that. But the point I was making before the break is that there's something super unusual about 2012, and most people really don't get it. I mean, they think that it just has something to do at the end of the Mayan calendar. That's really just a freckle on the blueprint of what's really unfolding and how many different ancient societies, some of which we mentioned before the break, some of which we could talk about at some other point, but in addition to that, consider that in 2012 the United States will elect a new president, hopefully a new one, maybe re-elect the same one. And Michael Savage says if we re-elect Obama, it'll be our last president. In 2012, the United Nations gets new leaders. 2012, Petrus Romanus is supposed to materialize. It wasn't also, by the way, it wasn't just Jonathan Edwards, but there were other early century writers like Reverend William J. Reed, who something like 130 or 40 years ago wrote his book Lectures on the Revelation concerning the papal system, and he wrote, "We are prepared to answer the question, when will the papal system come to an end? It will be destroyed in the year 2012. So what in the world, Steve? Why were so many individuals, most of them of an occultic nature, these others like Jonathan Edwards and Reverend Reed and others of Christians who would have been inspired by the Holy Spirit, why were they so fixated that in the year 2012, several things were going to happen? One, there would be distress among the nations. Secondly, there would be the coming of a messianic figure, the Antichrist, a false Christ who would appear, the arrival of the false prophet. And by the way, many of these cultures, on a different subject you and I have also covered numerous times, also talked about this being followed by the emergence of a new enlightened form of humanity. And when you look at, for instance, the prophecy of the Cumae Sibyl, the Novus Ordo Seclorum on the Great Seal of the United States, she specifically talks about a new golden age in which once again the gods will be commingled with mankind. She's talking about a reintroduction of Watcher/Nephilim/Gibborim activity happening upon the earth. And if you read Apollyon Rising 2012, you'll see that that's dated to occur in the year 2012. Then you have Rene Thibault, the code breaker, saying that it's going to happen in the year 2012. Anyway, the list is spooky. It's not just the Maya. They're only one small part of a much bigger picture that goes back into thousands of years of occult societies, looking forward to one event horizon, Steve, and they targeted the year 2012 in a way that's, I agree with the professor that interpreted the Book of the Kumiel, Richard, that it seems to smack of the Christian final judgment prophecies, the book of Revelation, the books of Daniel, the prophetic texts that tell us a time would come when a false prophet would appear, a false Christ would appear. The world is going to accept them as their messianic figure. The non-religious will just see them as heroes, if you will, political figures who are going to solve all of our issues. Religious people are going to accept them, and it is going to be both the Islamic community and the Vatican, the Catholic community, and much of the evangelical community. They are going to accept this individual as their coming Messiah. Now, the thing I loved about David Flynn is where a guy like me could do a tremendous amount of research, and I'm blessed to have people that I can, put on task to do research for me. And I hope that it doesn't sound like what I'm saying is my research is superficial. But compared to David Flynn, a lot of people's research is superficial. Because what Flynn did was he looked past the surface information. He looked past even these various occult sources and societies to find what was the source of the Mayan, the Aztec, the etc. Where was their knowledge coming from? Which then also would tie to the true source of the ET, UFO, abduction phenomenon, information coming out of the Vatican. But what's really behind it? I think that's one of the things that really drove him is what is the source, right? Where's it coming from? Who's inspiring all of this? So somebody prophesied. So what? What was behind it? And you may have read recently one of the entries on Raiders News Update into the Petrus Romanus series. And by the way, you said a moment ago, Steve, that chapter 17 was up. Well, actually, these are not the chapters in the book. This is just a lot of material based on research in the book.
Right, and I apologize for that. I was excuse me. I'm glad you made that clear because, again, you do this typically when you bring out a book. You put so much cool information that I call that wetting the whistle stops.
Well, a lot of it is because you'd be amazed how many people email us and they'll say something like, I can't even afford to buy the book. So we try to put just a ton of information out there that can help people. On the other hand, the Lord has instructed us to be good stewards, and I have people whose life depends on me being able to pay their salary. So there also is a stage at which I have to be able to function. You've probably heard these people in the past that have said, well, if you were really a man of God, you'd just give it all away free. And the answer to that is, yeah, I'd do that for a few weeks, and then everybody that works for me and depends on me and myself, we'd be bankrupt, out of business, and we wouldn't be able to share another thing with you because it takes revenue to be able to function, right?
Oh, yeah, I don't think, Tom, I don't think people understand. Literally, when you do a website, I mean, you pay for everything. And I remember one day adding up the money I'd spent on just talk radio because it wasn't always gifted or gratis. When I was on shortwave, it was like $75, $85 but when you get up to $750,000 for 20 years, not
right.
counting your website, and my website costs somewhere around $30,000 to $40,000 to maintain. And then that's not even counting all the times I would take trips and stuff. And I don't ask, I want to share something. I've got I believe, some of the neatest listeners in the world because I do. And when I'm able, I give a lot of books away. But I know there are people, when I hear that, if you were really a Christian, I basically want to say, what in the Hades do you do? Well, if they're on the internet, they can at least forward the internet. If they're emailing me their, convulsive requests, and one guy basically said, I got more important things to spend my money on your book, but it sounds interesting. I sent him back an email and said, no, thank you. Your heart's not ready, and your mind certainly isn't. And I'm serious about that, okay? Now, look, I've given, and I'm not saying whoopee, but it's just I say to any veteran, they can have my book, and I'm not speaking for you on this. I'm just speaking for myself. But even then, one lady got mad at me. She says, I don't care how much money and books you give away. You're an angry man. Well, so is God. He's angry at sin every day. And I think that, we've got such an explosive. I'm sitting here going, okay, we've got 2012, 2019. Let me make it clear to everyone. I think you just said it. It's a freckle, the Mayan calendar. There are thousands, if not 10,000, ancient arcane writings, all pointing out. And Tom, my contention is the fallen angels. Not only if you really go almost word for word in the book of Enoch or in Hanok, and I've got one of a really good translation by a very brilliant man who gave me permission to reprint it for my listeners. The point that I think people have got to understand. Let me give you a good example. MySpace and Facebook. You know what that was called in Star Trek East? That's the Borg. And a very prominent man who's now dead, brilliant beyond, and at one time associated with Majestic. And if you don't know what Majestic is, go Google it. He said, Steve, he said, where do you think the ultimate control lies? And I said, with he who not only develops. He said, no, it's not he who develops it, it's he who controls it. And he maintained, Tom, now listen to this, I don't know if you've ever heard this, but he said that the whole, you're going to love this, the whole social networking, especially in virtual reality, was an alien, not meaning foreign to the boundaries of the United States, but not of this planet. It was, if you will, the ultimate web to snare everybody into the hive, H-I-V-E. For the record, the word hive exists in special operations terminology for the giants that are in stasis, and I've talked about, oh, good night, Dr. Moldeshev, who has seen them, and all the different people that have viewed them. I've had people in my office, and they said it's interesting. He said it's a simultaneous sharing of a command that goes out. It's like, if you will, an alien mind-melting neural network. Am I being clear? Does that come across clear enough?
Yeah, and what's interesting is how so much of the presentations, I've been traveling the U.S. this year, going to these different conferences, and they want me to talk about what's happening now with neural networking, actually the whole hive mind issue, the approach of strong artificial intelligence, how we're going to create systems that will allow the brain to be integrated with strong artificial intelligence systems, what the state of the future from the Millennium Project is saying, all these, what the Jasons are saying to the Department of Defense, and it sounds very much like what you're talking about right now. That on the near landscape, there is a moment in which we are going to be integrated with machine intelligence, but there won't be any coming back from it. And so then you have to question, what does that even mean? If we won't even be human anymore as we understand it today, but what are the implications of it?
Well, I think the implications, and this is what people have got to understand, nobody is a better authority than King Jesus. Jesus said, except for the sake of the elect, if those days weren't shortened, there'd be no flesh left alive. I can basically, give Ray Kurzweil, a great title for whatever he wants to title his next book, No Flesh Left Alive, because when you and I first started taking on transhumanism, singularity, genetic Armageddon, mutagenic properties of radio frequencies, and when you wrote Apollyon 2012, and I was writing Genesis 6 and whatever else I was writing, it's just all back there in history. The thing that was amazing to me, Tom, was the absolute, as you and I, and look, I'm not taking credit, but I believe this is my calling and your calling. It was almost, you and I would say something, then immediately they would come out and counter it. I think you've noticed that. And I mean, you've been taken on by, some of the transhumanists, and I forget the guy that wrote the essay, and basically to them, we're Neanderthals. But the point is that when somebody called me a Neanderthal, I said, well, yeah, remember this, that you were taught in anthropology, that was in the family tree or lineage of Homo sapien. I said, guess what? Separate species. What does that do? And I said this. I said, it's a good thing you guys didn't, I said the only thing lacking in anthropology is a jawbone of an ass, courtesy of Samson. I said, because then you could have built a whole new man, and I don't even want to tell you what I called him, okay? Well, I'll tell you this. Assicus ridiculous about, around the jawbone of ass. People don't know what I'm talking about is that entire, whether it's Australopithecus.
Tell me again, because only Steve Quayle could come up with this. Assicus what?
Well, I forget what I just said. Assicus stupidicus. Because again, I'm sorry, but I come on, it's a biblical term, or maybe it should be more biblical. Assicus dumicus. Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
That dumbass speaking. That is a scripture. Look, here's what I think. I want to say this one more time. I don't even know where it is on my website. I got so much stuff on there, but it's called The Map of the Creator. Have you ever seen that? The one that's 500 million years old, and it's absolutely the Earth and every single terrain feature from outer space. It's almost as if you were basically with the Hubble's telescope looking down on the Earth and every ridge, every valley, and they claim. And look, I'm not going to argue over dating, but and even these things, they all have that coordinated time sequencing. So here's what I'm saying. I don't believe, Tom, that people understand that they've already, if they're on Facebook, and I am opposed to it, if they're on, what is it called, Twitter, Flitter, whatever it is, I know what Twitter is, and I really don't. I'm not on it, okay? But basically, the thing that people have got to understand, you have been assimilated. Before you were told you were going to be assimilated. And when I was talking to a special operations general, he said, Steve, this is how the giants return. This is how the fallen angels work. I went, oh, I get it. That's even their alien technology. And he said, you're starting to see it now. So, Tom, here's what we're trying to tell people tonight. Okay, everything is in place for the final pope, the revealing of Antichrist. If people don't like the time frame 2012 to 2016, putting Jesus into 2019, I'll inevitably get, well, we're going to be out of here before then, so all you guys are wasting time. Well, if you're wrong and we're right, then there's some interesting dilemmas that let's say, this forces those who would criticize to deal with. So the hive mentality, okay, that hive mentality is what's coming back. Because when you deal with the world of the occult, it's amazing. And I've interviewed enough of those guys over the years, and ladies, to know that it's like they know that they know when they're all together. And I'm not just talking about Beltane or Samhain or whatever. I'm talking about there is a hive-like mentality. Now, if you oppose the hive, you're given the most wonderful thing that God, the King of Glory, has ever created, and it's called free will. I'm not chemically determined. I'm not a spontaneous outburst of an amoeba's love life. We are... You've got to have that one, too. We are absolutely designed with the most careful, the most beautifully articulated genius, the fingerprints of genius, the heart of God, the absolute Spirit of God, the good night, the Ruach, I think it's what, in Hebrew, Ruach, I can't do it, but Ruach HaKodesh, and the thing is that we exploded with life, and now, can I tell you something? We're too, and I'll use this word because the other word would be offensive, we're too bloody lazy to even take up that cross, which represents all the power, all the absolute redemption, everything Jesus is. And when Jesus said, to as many as receive me, him speaking, gives he the power to become the sons of God, it is a question of power. And right now, the ball of power, if you will, is in their court. God did say, Tom, and I think you're the antidote for this. I'm the antidote. David certainly was. And everybody who writes apologetically, there's some amazing men and women of God out there writing. But the point is that God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Now, that's a cutesy statement until you start asking the Lord individually in prayer, Lord, does that apply to me? And God says in that Scripture, you know that, it's because not they aren't presented with the knowledge, but they renounce it or they reject it, okay? they won't embrace it because it interferes with their paradigm. You and I have talked about the day if they have their way, there is no more humanity. And I got to tell you something. My favorite website is your website. I mean, I do mine, and it's a compendium of everything. And I really love Raiders because obviously you and I have been doing this long enough to know that we know where it's headed, and we're trying to lead people out of the path of destruction. But I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about transhumanism, singularity, robotics, and sentient robots, and basically the Hercules gene being introduced into super soldiers, or all of the qualities that you're now hearing coming out of DARPA, I'm telling you, Tom, people have got to understand the day of apathy, indifference, and casual yawning, burping, and chirping in church is over, in my opinion.
Yeah, hey, listen to this excerpt from the current State of the Future report from the Millennium Project. It's just a short excerpt, but think of the implications of this short paragraph. Quote, as computer code is written to create software to augment human capabilities, so too genetic code will be written to create life forms to augment civilization, end quote. Wrap your mind around that. And the bottom line is what they're saying, Steve, is your point, that humanity is being assimilated right now, that artificial intelligence is on the near horizon, that our brains will be integrated with these systems. But then what's going to happen is that our natural, God-created, normal, human gray matter is not going to be able to process the teraflops of information that will be necessary to be integrated to the Borg. And so then what's going to happen is new forms of life, genetic code is literally going to have to be written that will then be integrated with our cognitive capacity in order to bring us up to a point where we will be able to appreciate being a part of this new Borg technology. This is being forecast for the immediate future. They're saying essentially right now the code has to be written. So, Steve, as always, you're prophetic and you're ahead of the curve on what's happening, but most of the world's not going to get it. I would say this, and I found this out, by the way, after my house burned down last year. The sympathy, because we've talked tonight about, the other side, the waterless cloud society that's out there working overtime, the buzzing flies of the Lord of the Flies that's trying to distract people from the truth. But there is another side to that, and I'll tell you what, when my house burned down, there was people from all over the world that wanted us to know that anything we needed, I don't care if it was money, a place to live, a car, automobiles, people were willing to give us anything. And if we had been the kind of people who would take advantage, we could have went on our website and said, please help us, and we could have milked a ton of resources out of people. I'd never do that, and so we went on Prophecy in the News with Gary Sturman, and we said, we're okay, don't worry about us. We had insurance on our home. We've got a temporary home. We're in it right now. The kind of stuff that can't be replaced is lost, obviously, little pictures that the children made for us when they were coming up through school and that sort of thing. So it was particularly hard for Nita, but those are the kind of losses that money's not going to do anything to help anyway. And we wanted people to know that. Now, there were a few people that still gave anyway, even though we were telling them not to. And I can let those people know that Nita, my wife, she supports about 24 missionaries. And the revenue that came in went directly back. For instance, there was a guy and his wife that sent us a check for $1,000. A few days later, Larry Spargamino of Southwest Radio Church, him and his wife barely made it into their tornado shelter in Oklahoma, last year when the tornadoes went through. And when they came out of their tornado shelter, there was nothing left. Their house, their barns, their vehicles, everything was gone. Well, then we turned around and sent those monies forward to them. Pay it forward, that movie? So that's what we did. And I'm very thankful to God that we are in a position where we would be able to do that. But what I'm saying is we found that there is also this other side the real side, the true Christians, they really are there. And Steve, they're listening. They're paying attention to what we're saying. And you know it and I know it. And so we're very thankful to God that you and I have been put in a position right now as we're entering into the end of the end times, that we've been given some small opportunity to be a blessing to those people and to I haven't been a pastor for many years, but I can tell you, Steve, that in many ways you and I are pastors to these people, and we care deeply about them. And so I'd want people listening to this show to know that we're also aware of that side of the body of Christ, and we're very thankful to have the relationship, the friendship, the kinship that we have with them.
Well, and I think that's well stated, and I think it's important for people to understand that basically a bishop and the New Testament word, you know, the admonition from Paul was like, don't give them a hard time because they watch for your souls. We're trying to tell people right now actively that the ultimate soul catcher, the ultimate soul stealer, the very dark denizens of damnation are out to release. And, you know, I get then I love the other emails, okay? The other emails I get, oh, you just sell fear to sell your books, blah, 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 blah. My answer to that is that, look, I have stated 100 times, maybe 200 times, the antidote for fear is knowledge, okay?
Right.
And when someone comes with wet pants and tries to blame me that I made them, let's say, lose control of their body functions, I mean, that's going a little bit too far. I mean, seriously, Tom, the thing is that people are scared, and I have learned this, that if God's people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, then the reverse is true, that they'll be redeemed by the implementation and the obedience to that knowledge.
Well, here's some deep knowledge that David Flynn masterfully accomplished in his lifetime, in that he looked past the occult sources of these societies to try to find the secret source of Mayan, Aztec, and these other numerous cultures. You may, I was going to say this earlier. I posted a Petrus Romanus article. I sent it to Donna, and she posted it, that we're running at Raiders News Update right now, where it mentioned the Mesoamerican name Amaruca.
Yep.
And I'm not going to talk about that, but some people believe that that's the real origin for the name America. And in that article, we pointed to the legendary source